Welcome to Black House Tales. Let's begin our story. England, 1786. Sis. A piteous moan, picked up by the wind howling outside the window, is broken into a low sob. Sis, help me. I'm so scared, I'm so cold. I am all alone. The blonde girl's eyes flew open, and she slowly crouched on the bed. Stubborn branches climbed through the window. In the light of the full moon, they were like countless ubiquitous, eternally seeking warm flesh hands of monsters from the most terrible nightmares of childhood. The branches battered against the glass barrier, scratching, grinding, trying to penetrate and grab the girl, looking at them through the window. Once they grabbed her, the clawed hands would drag the girl into the darkness and never let her go again. Like her little brother, who calls for his little sister every night. And she obediently goes, sneaking barefoot, so as not to wake up her tired father after a grueling day's work, so as not to disturb her seriously ill mother with the creak of wooden proverbs. It was the middle of the night. Its silence was only occasionally broken by the wind that shamelessly shook the tops of sturdy old trees. The little girl unscrewed the crumbling wicket door and looked with determined eyes toward the forest. At the midnight hour, in the light of the silver disk, the eternally magical, friendly forest was like a ruthless beast, towering over the defenseless tree its black wall. Sis. A new gust of cold wind blew through the leaves in her brother's thin voice. Sis, where are you? Coming. Picking up her puckered skirts, the blue-eyed girl headed toward the black wall of mighty trees. From nowhere clouds covered the already dark sky, hid the meager scattering of stars with the beautiful moon, a strong wind rose, chilling to the bones, and milky white fog flowed between the roots on the grass. The brave girl wrapped herself in her shabby garment, listened to the song of the wind, and stubbornly continued on her way to nowhere. Her brother no longer called out to her, but she kept going farther and farther into the thicket. The little girl felt her brother was near, waiting, and no one else could help the poor man except her. Adults have long stopped looking for him. They do not believe that the boy is alive, as well as do not believe in her stories, do not believe that her brother calls his sister for the third night in a row. Sis, I am very near. The wind, quieted for a moment, blew again with renewed vigor. Pay attention. The paper swayed gently in the waning wind, and sank into the girl's palm. On the yellow paper was a charcoal image of an unusual man of very tall and supple, incredibly thin build. His long thin limbs curved randomly, his perfectly round head was tilted to the side, and his face. Is that even possible? Nevertheless, this man had no face. His black robes were developing in the whistling of a non-existent wind, and the black ribbons of the man's robes looked like a cluster of flexible moving tentacles. The drawing sent shivers running down her damp skin, but the girl could not take her eyes off the strange man. Sis. Her brother's voice echoed nearby, and the little girl caught the curly head between the tree trunks out of the corner of her eye. Alwyn. Alwyn called out to her sister, but there was a low, tinkling laugh in reply. Alwyn. Breathing heavily, the girl ran out into the clearing, tears of joy dripping from her eyes. At the other end of the green lake, right in front of her, stood her little brother. He hadn't changed a bit. The same golden curls, the same pale sweet face with snub nose and blue eyes. Alwyn. The girl exhaled in relief and took a step toward him when her brother stopped her with a plump hand. My dear Kristel. The boy spoke to her in a chesty, husky voice. Did you know that fairies can be evil? Alwyn's mouth was contorted in a soundless cry, his eyes rolled upward, and his pretty face turned into a mask of chilling terror. Dozens of long, wriggling tentacles detached themselves from the trunk of the age-old oak tree. Their edges entered the mouth, eye sockets, nostrils, and cold flesh of her little brother, and the insatiable pit of darkness swallowed him up. Shaking like a leaf, Kristel dropped silent tears, unable to move. Her eyes, wide open, exuded terror, and her eyes were fixed on the trunk of an oak tree, covered in darkness. My brother's voice sounded in my head along with screams, cries, and pain. The earth spat lumps of grass, the wind died down, a faint moon came out, peered through the branches. Two long, thin arms reached out from under the ground and wrapped their arms tightly around the girl's legs, pulling her down with them. She was gone, only a loud cry of fear lingered in the treetops. A dream, just another nightmare. 3 days ago, Kristel's little brother disappeared, and 3 nights in a row the girl has had nightmares. Alwyn calls for her beloved little sister, crying, and she searches among the trees, looking for her by the river. She looks and finds, and as she sees her brother's face, the thin man appears at once and takes him away. Where? Why? Unknown. Waking up, the girl finds a crumpled piece of paper with a charcoal picture of the kidnapper. The adults do not believe her, although they have been behaving very strangely for the past month. Ah, yes, Alwyn was not the only missing child, nor the first, nor, it seemed, the last. To the quiet, picturesque village in the middle of nowhere, far from the hustle and bustle of civilization, came great sorrow. Exactly 1 month earlier, the first child, Darla Mortimer, 6 years old, had disappeared. Then the men, armed with pitchforks and torches, combed the whole village, looking through the woods and the river. But there was not a trace to be found. Little Darla seemed to have vanished into thin air. And 3 days later, the neighbor's little boy disappeared. His parents had put him to bed as usual, and in the morning he was gone from his crib. No blood, no sign of a struggle, no cries for help. Absolute nothing again. In just 1 month, 10 children between the ages of 3 and 12 went missing. For a village where peace and quiet reigned unceasingly, and where good, hardworking, responsive people lived, the abductions came as a real shock. And along with the village, its inhabitants changed. People no longer left their homes unnecessarily, they became sullen and silent. No one said so out loud, but within the walls of their homes they blamed each other for the children's disappearance. Despite the precautions, the children were no longer left alone. Alwyn had disappeared from his bed 3 days ago. Neither the sister sleeping next to him nor the father and mother through the wall heard any alarming sounds. There was a grave silence in the house that dark night. 3 days passed. In that time, none of the remaining 15 children had disappeared. That meant that one day the unknown kidnapper would come for a new victim. The adults were whispering among themselves, looking around. They looked frightened, and stopped talking at the sight of the children. This morning Kristel overheard a conversation between 2 women on the west side of the village. The half-tone conversation was about another recent, very unfortunate incident. Pity about Mr. Tomswood, shook her head at him, a full, short, middle-aged woman. They should never have beaten him to death with sticks. What? Said the young woman in astonishment. Alex was last seen outside his house. And they found the poor boy's nosebleed in his garden. Didn't your mother ever tell you about the thin master when you were a child? Asked the first one even more quietly. Did not scare him, so that you do not go far into the woods? Do you, Mrs. Carlson, mean the evil fairy of the Black Forest? The second one grinned. Well, that's a local tale. Yeah, it's a story. Mrs. Carlson glanced disapprovingly at her young, inarticulate companion. Is it also a story that children go missing? The darkness of the cockroach. In the old days, people honored the old traditions, respected the inhabitants of the forests. If we paid tribute to Lord High once every 5 years, we wouldn't have such a misfortune now. What are you talking about? The girl was horrified. Could it be that they are children? Kristel, listening, accidentally stepped on a dry branch, and the crackling sound made both women turn toward the ramshackle barn, behind which the girl had taken shelter. Mrs. Carlson waved her hand and went about her business. That same evening, Kristel asked her father about the master, but he brushed her off, sending her daughter to see how her mother was doing. Don't be silly, all the father said. But by the look on his face, the girl knew that her father knew the story of the mysterious man. He just did not want to talk about it. What for? Kristel looked at the black wall of the forest through the window and her heart involuntarily clenched. Could it be true that children were being stolen by a man living in the woods? Who was he, and why did he want children? What are his goals, and what does he do with the abductees? Having dealt with her mother, the girl went to her room. Her eyes kept trying to close, and the terrible images kept coming back to her mind. Children with eyes red with tears were playing in the trees. They were calling for their relatives, but they were not heard. Some try to run away, to return to the village. And then the thin man emerges from the gloom. His long, nimble tentacles slip through the shroud of mist, catch up with and grab the little fugitives, then drag them back into the forest. Their cries will fly over the black forest for a long time, until dawn. The girl could not stay long in the heavy shackles of sleep. She felt a strong push in the back, and then the blanket slipped smoothly to the floor. Reluctantly, she opened her eyes and sat up on the bed. A faint knock on the wall drove away the last echoes of Morpheus. Her mother, exhausted from her severe illness, often called her daughter that way when she needed something. Pulling on her robe, the girl wondered where her father had gone in the middle of the night. Mother. Opening the door, she called out, Mother. A candle flickered beside the sick woman's bed, but the light was enough to get a good look at the nocturnal visitor. Over the emaciated body of the woman leaned a tall man in black robes. His non-existent eyes stared at the woman's death mask, his thin arms poised at the head of her bed, and long tentacles woven of black smoke swirled from the ceiling. Your good mother is dead. The thin man lifted his head, and Kristel cringed in horror at the doorway. Goodness is always followed first by sickness and then by death. His hoarse-chested voice echoed inside the girl's head, causing pain, awakening despair, making her feel the presence of death himself at her side. There was a muffled moan from the deceased's chest, her eyes rolled up, and her mother's gaze foreign, cold, as if demonic, turned to her daughter. Kristel's mouth distorted, but no sound escaped her chest. The thin man wrapped his tentacles around her frail body, a crushing pain shackling the girl's flesh. A strong gust of wind swung the window open, a heavy milky fog fell from the street into the house. It filled the tiny room, crowding out the fresh air. "You're next." The dead mother's curled hand pointed at Kristel, and the girl, gripped by terror, lost her senses. She regained consciousness early in the morning in her own bed. The first roosters had crowed, and when they had ceased, she heard a sobbing sound from the next room. On cotton legs, the girl walked to her parents' room, and tears laced her eyes. Clutching Sylvia's cold, pale hand, her father was sobbing on his knees beside her bed. Knowing that any words were futile, her daughter put her arms around her father's shoulders and crouched beside the deceased. The night terror had come to life, the deceptive light of day failed to chase it away. Had the nightmare been merely a dream? Doubts overwhelmed the unhappy child when Kristel noticed a small scrap of black cloth in her mother's other hand. On shaky legs, the girl approached the table, trying not to look at Sylvia's treasure. Barely dropping the glass filled with water, the girl went back to her father and handed him the water. Sylvia was buried at dinnertime of the same day. The funeral was attended by half the villagers, the fear stronger than the last honors, and Kristel was the only child in the funeral procession. The weather deteriorated sharply. Leaden clouds covered the sky, the wind howled, the day became like an early evening, and a small disgusting rain began to fall from the gloomy sky. The inconsolable father wept on his knees as he looked at the coffin hiding under lumps of damp earth. Those sympathetic to the grief of others crowded around the new grave. The girl stood a little farther away from the mourners, staring ahead of her with unseeing eyes. The rain and wind increased, and a gray mist began to rise from the forest. Its shreds stretched toward the pogost, cautiously gliding between the graves and creeping toward the mourning procession. Kristel felt a burning gaze on the back of her head and slowly turned around. In the shadow of the sprawling pines stood him. The familiarly faceless master stood motionless, his black robes billowing in the wind. The thin man's non-existent eyes stared into hers. A petrified fear took hold of the girl, and her heart seemed to stop beating. "Father." With an incredible effort, Kristel managed to raise her hand, to touch her parent's shoulder. "Father, can't you see the High Lord?" "Kristel," he said wearily, glancing toward the forest, "there is no one there." If his guest had had lips, he would have stretched them out into a satisfied smile. The thin man's already long arms stretched toward the girl, now only a few yards apart. The adults looked around with a touch of fear, whispering softly, but most likely not seeing anyone. The Lord of the Forest's palm turned upward, and with his index finger the tall one beckoned Kristel toward him. "How could it be?" the girl asked in a trembling voice, her fingers digging into her father's shoulder. "He is here," the child snatcher, "very close. He has come for me. Mr. Lannister." Mrs. Carlson, the same one who had told her friend about the evil fairy of the Black Forest, turned to him. "The girl is tired. The loss of her mother is too painful for a child's mind. Let me take Kristel home." "Of course." The man nodded. "I would be very grateful to you. Come, my dear." The woman took the girl by the hand, white as January snow. "You need to rest." She tried to speak calmly, encouragingly, affectionately. But there was fear in her tone. She glanced toward the forest, and all Kristel could see was mist, and the trunks and crowns of trees wet with rain. But the unfortunate child knew that the Lord Highman was still watching her, and there was no hiding from him even beyond the walls of the citadel. The kind-hearted Mrs. Carlson, groaning sympathetically, gave the trembling girl warm milk, and fed her the fresh pastries she had brought from home. The warm drink and delicious food did the trick. Kristel was swept off her feet by sleep as soon as her head touched the pillow. "Father." Exhaling, the girl clutched the cold sheet in her hand. "Father." There was no one around. The girl was all alone in the empty, dark house. The shutters of the windows flapped like the wings of crows, the resilient jets of downpour whipped the walls and floor. The front door to the humble abode slammed shut abruptly, and Kristel jumped on the bed. Hastily dressed, the child rushed to the threshold of her father's house. In the flash of lightning her eyes discerned a lone figure in a traveling cloak, heading toward the forest. "Father, wait." Leaving her fear languishing within the walls of the house, she rushed in pursuit. "Father, stop. Where are you going?" There was no reply, and the man quickened his pace. Tripping over her own skirts, Kristel fell and rose again. With enviable tenacity the girl fought the weather, oblivious to the branches whipping at her face, tangling in her hair. She didn't let the almost indistinguishable figure in the half-light out of her sight. "Kristel." Her father's voice made the girl turn back. Her foot caught in a hole in the floor, and the child went tumbling over the low ledge. She sobbed softly as she rubbed her bruised leg. She had lost sight of her father, and had never known the reason why he had abandoned his daughter in this hour of grief. "Kristel." Her father's voice rang out again, and this time, it sounded nearby, as if it came from above. "My daughter." Gold lightning flashed through the trees, and a shriek resonated through the thicket. All the colors of horror were reflected in the eyes of the drenched girl. On the branches of the tree was the mutilated corpse of her father. Lightning lit the last spark in Mr. Lannister's smoldering eyes, and his bleeding lips whispered a single word to his daughter: "Run." And she ran, but not back to the house. Fear whipped her back, drove her into the heart of the forest. The unfortunate woman stopped only when her legs refused to carry her mistress further. Scarred and lonely Kristel collapsed on the grass carpet, forgetting herself with sobs. Suddenly the wind died down, the rain stopped, and the moon appeared in the gloomy sky. It illuminated the familiar clearing, and the child's cowardly body tensed with fear pouring through her veins. Her eyes slowly slid over the thin, long body and stopped on a face as white as the moon itself. Mr. Tallman was standing near the same tree that had appeared to the girl in her nightmare. Except now she was not asleep. The thin man opened his arms and his arms stretched to the tree trunks behind the girl's back. Swallowing, Kristel succumbed to the evil spell. In the light whiff of the returning wind, moans and cries could be heard, and the girl slowly drew closer to the Lord. And then her palms touched the thin body, the creature's head leaned toward the child, and her arms embraced Kristel. Dozens of tentacles burst from behind his back, with them the thin man clasped the embrace and the fog released from the ring engulfed both, leaving not even a shred of cloth behind. Bavaria, 1968. It was a white day on the street. The sun was at its zenith, the weather was warm and friendly. The green treetops and bright flowers delighted the eyes of the park's many visitors. Laughter and joy were given by the carefree people to one another today. Nothing seemed to spoil such a wonderful day, nothing foretold trouble. Suddenly a destroying wind came from nowhere. It caught the black heavy clouds and they covered the sun. It was evening in the midst of the day. People froze where they stood, bright colors faded, flower petals hurried away from the park in the same wind. Sorrow gripped the living, sorrow took hold of their souls, their hearts. "Look," whispered one of the visitors, "what is it, there among the trees?" The branches of the trees were lifted at the behest of the wind and parted. Among the fresh foliage were two men, a girl and a tall, very thin man, dressed in a funeral suit and a white shirt and red tie. The girl looked at the people with vacant eyes. There was no fear in her eyes, on her face. But the girl's companion had no face at all. Instead of the usual features of the eye, there was a smooth white skin. "It's the thin man." A frightened cry came from someone. Paralyzing fear will not release the captives from their shackles. He would only allow dozens of pairs of eyes, frozen in the alley, to watch, to show panic, to search for a non-existent escape route. The camera shutter clicked, and the tall man lowered his head to his shoulder. In a single moment, all the electronic instruments howled, hissed, squealed. The lost boy, about 3 years old, sobbed tearfully, releasing a balloon. "Run," the girl whispered, and the dense mist, like a wild beast, enlisting the help of flexible tentacles, rushed to quench its perennial hunger. Who was he? Where had he come from, and why? What is his real name? What are his goals? Why does he kidnap children? No one knows the answers to these questions. Only one thing is certain. As long as the Lord Highman wanders the same paths as people, children will not cease to disappear from their beds, will not cease to suffer nightmares. But who dares to defy him? Could it be you who dares? I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.